Hello, this is Anton, and you're watching non-animated Antoons. I am back with my sad voice to talk about something that I don't think gets touched upon that often. The world of animation offers a wide variety of options to choose from, to be inspired by, to hold in high regard, and there is rarely much talk on what the differences are. The most I usually hear is 2D versus 3D, but that's honestly narrowing things down a little too much. You do not have to be an animation expert to see that there are a large number of art styles that come from a certain person or a certain company. However, every artist is influenced by something, and that something either was the norm of one age or became the norm of another age. Sometimes a certain style became the norm because of the knowledge and technology that was available, but a lot of the time the style is the norm because it is what appeared to be popular at the time. With this in mind, I think it is best to talk about the most used different varieties of animation and their strengths and weaknesses. It's not intended to be a history lesson, but it can still be informative. If there is a goal here, it is definitely to show that animation is truly an art form that offers more than the general public wishes to admit. So I hope this will be an eye-opening video for you all to enjoy. But first, sponsor time. Here's a message for anyone interested in video editing. Are you tired of bending over backwards for Adobe? Do you hate messing with freeware editors to even get them to work and then paying hundreds of dollars for basic effects and functions? Well, today I come to you with a solution to that problem, Filmora 9. When you start a new project in Filmora, you can just drop your video in there, and if the project and video parameters are different, you can change the project, no need to start over. Filmora has good compatibility on all relevant platforms. Setup is as easy as hitting a button. The effects look good and are surprisingly easy to use. This video took me a whole 10 minutes to edit in Filmora. Check it out in the description. It's free to use and I've enjoyed it quite a lot so far. The first animation style I want to talk about is an influential yet recently ridiculed one. In the beginning of cartoon animation, there were various styles that were tried, such as the rice paper drawings of Little Nemo from Winsor McCay, the famous cartoonist of the NY Herald and his moving comics. There was also the short McCay later made, Gertie the Dinosaur, which was the first to use keyframes, registration marks, tracing paper, the mutoscope action viewer, and animation loops. Finally, there was the chalk on blackboard look in arguably the first animated short ever, Phantasmagoria by Emil Cole. However, there was one style that stuck with audiences, becoming the standard of what cartoons and animation should look like. The style is, of course, rubber hose animation. At the time animation was up and coming, comic strips were also coming into prominence, and some of these comic artists were fascinated by the art of moving pictures. There was some trial and error, but soon the animation of rubber hose was born. Its earliest star has to have been Felix the Cat, exploring an exaggeration of life through the ways he reshapes his body or the environment around him changes shape. The style began to evolve, especially as new characters began to come into the picture, like Julius, Oswald, Bimbo, Mickey, Goofy, Foxy, Goopy, Piggy, Bosco, Buddy, Betty Boop, Popeye, Coco, Farmer, Alfalfa, and Flip, with companies like Disney, Warner Brothers, and Fleischer being slowly on the rise. Bill Nolan, working on the Felix short, was said to have been the one to give Rubber Hose its distinctive look, with the simple pie-cut eyes, the white faces on the ink-blot black bodies, and often short stature. Not every character looked like this, but they still exhibit a certain quality that just about all Rubber Hose characters do have. The bodies of the characters, especially the limbs, were free-flowing in how they moved, their exaggerations helping the cartoony, non-structured world, which is quite different from the audience's real, physical world. It also helped express emotion for the simple characters, especially since sound did not exist for cartoons back then, though most Rubber Hose cartoons kept their exaggerated style even when sound began to rise up. Their bouncy nature and antics of these Rubber Hose characters also often move along with the music of the shorts, giving a special rhythm that the audiences can be mesmerized by. Some people have also found some shorts scary because they often dealt with booby traps, ghosts, skeletons, and even hell and the devils that inhabit it. The animators were given a lot of freedom to depict the worlds they wanted and how the characters they have starring in their shorts would react to them. You could also feel the old-timey style style if the images are slightly grainy in quality. This of course is not how these films looked initially, but there are some people who feel it adds to the retro look of the rubber hose animation. As cartoons transitioned into color, the animators decided to experiment more with how to portray their characters. The rhythmic atmosphere started to seem not rich enough. They wanted to not have gag-centered stories all the time and try to focus more on fleshing out movements a little more. Not necessarily get rid of animation, but use it as an alternative for live action, being able to do the things that live action at the time could never do. Now all animation can do this, but it was becoming clear that animators wanted their cartoons to be taken a little more seriously, and the free-flowing nature of Rubber Hose did not seem to cut it anymore. The Fleischer Studios held to the Rubber Hose style the longest, finally conforming to the more contemporary animation style by 1940. The 1940 marked the beginning of the Golden Age era of animation, thus leaving Rubber Hose behind for the rest of the century. However, it seemed that though a lot of time has passed, people have given Rubber Hose a bit of resurgence recently. Some ways were pretty good, other ways were not so great, but the fact that some effort was put forth into a style that many people stuck their noses up as if to say it is beneath them, it goes to show that any style in entertainment can come back and make an impact on audiences once again. And before people say it, no, Adventure Time is not like Rubber Hose. Just because a character has noodle arms does not mean they are automatically Rubber Hose. Now the next type, or better yet, a technique in animation I want to talk about comes before Rubber Hose. It is one that has not been too prominent, at least compared to other animation methods, but it is still a captivating and unique type, and that type is cutout animation. Cutout is one of the earliest forms of animation, where it simulates 2D animation using a card, piece of paper, some stiff fabric, or even photographs. Though it can be considered the 2D version of stop motion, there is still a bit of style to distinguish itself from traditional animation. There were actually quite a few films and shows produced in the cutout technique. One even predates Felix the Cat, that one being All'Aposto by Reno Cristiani, the first animated feature film ever made. Reno has made other films like Sin Dejar Rastros and Peloponnese, the latter of which is the first animated film made with sound. Unfortunately, the majority of his work, including those films, were lost in various fires. Only a bit of his cutout animation survives, so you at least get to see a glimpse of what it looks like. What we do have as the oldest surviving animated film is Die Abenteuer des Prinzen Ahmed, or The Adventures of Prince Ahmed by Lotte Reiniger. The cutout animation is done with a silhouette look, almost as if it is a shadow puppet show, and it is quite a treat to marvel at. There are other examples of cutout animation like The Fantastic Planet or Twice Upon a Time. But there are also TV shows like Ivor the Engine, Blue's Clues, and even segments of Monty Python's Flying Circus. However, the biggest thing that is cut out to us is, without a doubt, South Park. Now yes, it does use certain tools like Power Animator and later Maya, but when it started, South Park legitimately used cutouts and still keeps that cutout style to this day, offering its own unique style to this technique, for better or worse. Now, as I said, cutout can be considered to be a form of stop motion, but stop motion as a whole is a different world of animation, so I'm going to describe it as a technique or method. Due to some cheapness, the traditional methods of animation can often be too expensive for most studios, so people often cut down on the budget in some cases by switching to stop motion, though now even that is considered too expensive for most studios, or at least too expensive because it may not be profitable, but we'll come back to that. The use of stop motion has existed since the early 1800s, with multiple pictures of the same people in different positions being converted to show a simulation of movement, but very few of these were meant for that type of purpose. It is like the videos I mentioned in my Q&A so that you can become a professional animation. However, since we are talking about animation, we're going to be mainly talking about stop motion, less in involving human actors and more involving non-living models. Stop motion is not an easy process, but it is cheaper and it still displays a lot of imagination and artistry. The stop motion technique is when you take a model, whether it be plastic or wood or clay, and take one shot of it, readjust its position, take another shot, readjust its position again, and rinse and repeat until you're able to compile the shots together into a scene, maybe even a short or a movie. It could be considered some form of puppetry. It has been used as a visual effect in live-action movies long before CGI, and we'll be getting to that. and it has also been used for full animated features. The first movie which nearly fully used the method of stop motion is a USSR movie called The New Gulliver, using clay figures for most of the film, with some live-action parts at the beginning and at the end. If you want the first fully animated stop-motion film, that would be Le Roman de Renard, or The Tale of the Fox. There were also short films made with stop-motion by George Pal in a series called Puppetoons. They included, but were not limited to, Tubby the Tuba and Dr. Seuss's The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cobbins. While the style has appeared off and on through the years, I think it was the 60s when it really started to get noticed. That's when there were stop-motion shows like The Magic Roundabout, Davy and Goliath, and Gumby. The latter two were created by the same man, Art Clokey, and Gumby being around since the 50s. The 60s and 70s were also the time when the company, Rankin Bass, began to take prominence, creating many specials on TV like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Year Without a Santa Claus, and they even made a few theatrically released films with their stop-motion animation. There have also been some notable stop-motion artists that gained some prominence, including Jan Schwankmajer, known for his surreal animation like in Alice and Faust. Then there was Nick Park, David Sproxton, as well as Peter Lord, who created Aardman in using their own distinctive claymation style, and Will Vinton, known for his cartoony, though sometimes bordering on disturbing animation in commercials like The California Raisins and Domino's Noid, in movies like Moonwalker and Return to Oz, and even his own feature film, The Adventures of Mark Twain.
What?
Hello,
Who are you?
an angel.
What's your name?
Satan.
Though the use of stop motion was slowly dying down, Tim Burton and Henry Selick's Nightmare Before Christmas slowly but surely brought back an interest in the stop motion medium, with its haunting yet fascinating and fun visuals, paying tribute to what came before while delivering something that does feel fresh and wonderful. Nightmare Before Christmas is probably the film that sparked people's interest in stop motion, and is the reason why this technique is still being used for new films to this day. Unfortunately, most companies are not interested in producing stop motion films, mainly because people have not been seeing them. So maybe this resurgence is not as great as it initially seemed. Let's hope things are different later. Now that we have stop motion out of the way, I wish to take you back to the point when most animation was moving on from rubber hose and changing its style for, some would say, the better. This is when sound and color leaped off the screen, and the cartoon characters people know and grew up with still exist prominently to this day. This would be the golden age of animation. This is when the movement of a character became less free-flowing. They did not quite lose the gags, but movements began to get much more lush and realistic. Walt Disney in particular was adamant about changing the way animation was seen by the public. 3-strip color, under the moniker of Technicolor, was created to breathe life into cartoon shorts, which were called Silly Symphonies. Mickey Mouse soon lost his initial rubber hose design in order to give him a better expressive face, which is where the modern Mickey was created in the making of Fantasia. In fact, while rubber hose characters did convey emotions that many audience members can understand, there was an effort to expand the characters' livelihoods by giving them supporting cast and giving each character distinct and unique personalities, creating characters like Pluto and Donald Duck. This was also when the short, bright cartoons started to become feature-length, a gamble no one expected to turn out well, but it became a financial success in the long run. The Fleischers were also around at the time, still mainly sticking to the rubber hose style with their characters like Betty Boop and Popeye, but also trying their hand at the techniques Disney tried to employ, not always succeeding. They did have their own techniques, like being able to make more realistic-looking humans for some of their projects, and we'll get to that too. However, while Disney was able to keep afloat even in the troubling times of the World War II, the Fleischers did not have as much luck, and their cartoons did not seem to hold the candle necessary to compete, causing Fleischers to eventually close their doors. This led to a new division being created at Fleischer's original studio, Paramount. This was called Famous Studios, the company that produced cartoons like Little Lulu and Noveltoons, the latter of which included characters like Baby Huey and Casper. Meanwhile, Warner Brothers would try and succeed in finding a new cartoon star to replace the ones that were not selling anymore anymore. What they eventually landed on was Porky Pig, and he was the mascot until Daffy Duck came along. Then Daffy was replaced when a new character slowly gained prominence, that character being the carrot-munching, wisecracking Bugs Bunny. The shorts that these cartoon characters star in, called Merry Melodies but better known today as Looney Tunes, employ a more wacky, zany sort of style, a style encouraged by Text Avery, in order to sell to a market Walt Disney was not going for. These characters gained prominence for their personality and their humor, in introducing a huge wide range of characters to watch, including, but not limited to, Elmer Fudd, Sylvester and Tweety, Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, and Taz the Tasmanian Devil. There were also many animators who helped flesh out the characters, giving them new dimensions, including Friz Freleng, Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, and Robert McKimson. MGM was also making its strides in animation, making their first star Barney Bear, and they also got Tex Avery, who created a few stars of his own, including Screwy Squirrel, George and Jr., and most notably Droopy. Tex also brought a more adult sense to the cartoons he was involved with. However, these characters were nothing compared to what was eventually created by the then young William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, a series of cat and mouse shorts which were soon christened Tom and Jerry. These cartoons were known for their two mostly silent but engaging characters, with perfectly timed and animated slapstick. While MGM managed to wrestle away an award from Walt Disney without the duo, it was the cat and mouse that helped MGM score the most Academy Awards, tying with Walt Disney's Silly Symphony series. There were many other studios that tried to compete with their own theatrical short cartoons with varying degrees of success. Walter Lantz Productions had Andy Panda, Chilly Willy and Woody Woodpecker. Terrytoons had Gandy Goose, Heckle and Jekyll and Mighty Mouse. But it was the company Columbia Pictures that soon had one animation studio that helped change the way cartoons were distributed forever. Columbia initially had Screen Gems, not truly producing a hit cartoon with the possible exception of The Fox and the Crow, and eventually dropped them in favor of the new studio. That studio is what I will be talking about next. During the making of Dumbo, anger rose up about inequities of pay and privileges at the non-unionized Walt Disney Productions, causing the Disney animators strike. In an interesting happenstance, one of the people on strike was John Hubley, who was personally mad at Disney for the increasing ultra-realistic designs he demands for his animation. John felt something like Chuck Jones's The Dover Boys had a better grasp at experimenting with character design, depth, and perspective. John Hubley, with some other colleagues, then formed a new company that would produce animated films with a freedom considered radical by other studios. That company was United Productions of America, or UPA, or UPA if you like. The company of UPA started by making Hellbent for Election, directed by Chuck Jones, and was made as a re-election campaign for FDR. It was a hit, but not quite what we're looking for. But UPA persevered onward, eventually being bought by Columbia Pictures. They sharpened their techniques by having Hubley direct two The Fox and the Crow shorts, employing their simplified style of sharp edges and minimal detail. The interest that these shorts sparked allowed them to create a new star, and one that hasn't been used yet, an old man. UPA created Mr. Magoo, the crotchety and nearsighted human. Compared to other cartoons at the time, he seemed very unique in his character and design, even winning UPA awards. Just as UPA was coming into its own, so was television. It was then that UPA really doubled down on their unique sparse animation. UPA had various techniques for their animation style. Landscapes that were once made from traditional perspectives were now composed of bare geometry, regular patterns, or even a single flat color plane. The flat animation with thick outlines style of UPA created a sense of infinite depth and opportunity, placing characters in an environmental surrounding that was imaginative and surreal. They also did not create unique details in every frame, but rather reused common parts between the frames, creating a fast production and an abstract and stylized art style. They would use smear frames to indicate a fast movement which has existed in animation before, but became more prominent as UPA took off. The simple art style also helped the company focus some of their shorts more on drama than humor. The company not only helped bring the world of cartoons into a fresh new take, they also soon brought their tunes to television. They were not the first, as Crusader Rabbit existed on TV first, but its style is not too far off from UPA, which became the standard for most television cartoons for many decades. They brought their award-winning shorts like Mr. Magoo and Gerald McBoing Boing to television and created more shows like Dick Tracy. The company's fast turnaround onto TV influenced other artists to distribute their own shows this way, and this caused the beginning of the end of the golden age of animation. It was much cheaper to either do the UPA style or an offshoot of such a style, and short cartoons made for the theaters were not in high demand like they used to be. The golden age would get one last hurrah with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but after that things changed, and we'll get to that too. There were many shows and shorts that were born out of this revolutionary at the time style, and they were not exactly UPA made, like Tom Terrific, Pink Panther, The Alvin Show, Tennessee Tuxedo and His Tales, Beanie and Cecil, Underdog. Even former Crusader Rabbit co-creator Jay Ward made his own shows in a similar style, mixed with a bit of Crusader Rabbit, which include, but not limited to, Rocky and Bullwinkle and George of the Jungle. Some companies even tried to utilize their own version of UPA style, such as Disney creating shorts like Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom, or even specials like Peanuts or How the Grinch Stole Christmas using some elements of the UPA technique. The ones to arguably make the most successful career out of doing their own version of the UPA style are the former Tom and Jerry creators Hanna-Barbera, now mainly focusing on cartoons made with funny animals, and a few human cartoons too. UPA did start to lose some reputation in the public's eyes, feeling their cartoons were looking less interesting compared to their theatrical shorts. UPA did have enough clout to make a few movies: 1001 Arabian Nights, Gee, That Looks Familiar, and Gay Purée, Gee, That Looks Familiar. In all seriousness, they did not do as well as they hoped, with Gay Purée bombing hard and the studio eventually shut down. However, there was eventually a revival of the exact UPA style in the 90s, starting with Two Stupid Dogs, and it lasted to even the late 2000s. But like I said, the animation scene moved to the company Hanna-Barbera, now the biggest animation name on television, making their own well-known shows like Yogi Bear, The Jetsons, and the first primetime cartoon, The Flintstones, though the company has a bit of a reputation of reusing their ideas with a not-so-fresh coat of paint. But what they also did was help bring to the table something that animators tried to implement but not fully succeed until now. There was a style I would like to coin myself. I was not entirely sure how to introduce it, but I think it is about time I introduced something I would like to call borderline. What is it? Borderline is a cartoon with mostly realistic look to the characters. The humans are not over-exaggerated in design and tend to move like a normal human would. More often than not, though, as animation would feature the things that no live-action movie could portray at the time, there would be an accompaniment of something unusual and imaginative. I should mention that often with these borderline cartoon shows, the animation tended to be stiffer, even in more fluid pieces of animation, because most humans are not as expressive as what is shown on cartoons. This style has actually been experimented on since the Golden Age, with Walt Disney trying to create characters looking close to real life, making Snow White using rotoscoping. Rotoscoping could also be a technique for borderline animation, where an animator animates their characters based on the movements of a live person. The Fleischer brothers had also dabbled in this more earlier, using rotoscoping by having one of the brothers dressed as a clown in order to perform the movements for what will eventually become Coco. They also used rotoscoping in many pretty realistic-looking humans for Gulliver's Travels and Mr. Buck Goes to Town. Their most notable attempt at more borderline animation was when they made the Superman cartoons, creating animated shorts that feature realistic-looking humans facing fantastical situations. Asia has also adapted it somewhat, trying rotoscoping with Princess Iron Fan and continuing to animate its own style with some remnants of borderline, even though anime often has the big-eyed look, mainly thanks to Osamu Tezuka's influence, while he was influenced by Disney. They still have the same sense of being mainly drawn realistically, while still having few fantastical elements present. The borderline look did not stay in most countries initially, but some other cartoons were given the chance, such as with Clutch Cargo, though that cartoon tried to animate by using real human mouths instead of animating the drawn mouth movement. Hanna-Barbera, in the middle of their animal-centric shows, also worked on shows involving superheroes and adventurous people like Space Ghost, Johnny Quest, Super Friends, and even their own interpretation of the Fantastic Four. The borderline look continued to be used in Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, where the titular dog was talking and acted very cartoony, but all the human characters were mainly animated like normal humans, with the possible exception of Shaggy. This persisted through the 70s and really picked up steam in the 80s. The artist Ralph Bakshi was also coming up and creating his personal animated films. Bakshi tried to draw more realism into his works, even including rotoscoping in most of his films. The 80s is also where mostly toy-based shows started to get off the ground, due to market realizing the potential cartoons could have in selling merchandise. This is how Care Bears, My Little Pony, Transformers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, and Thundercats came into being, and they were animated with a realistic look to many of their characters. They were even given help from Asian companies in the animation process, as we know something about animating in a borderline style. However, many of these shows were often stiff and did not have the same intriguing developments that were presented in Golden Age, UPA, or even Rubber Hose style. Not that no shows had these elements, but sometimes they are held back by the stiffness of the animation. For many, it seemed like animation was taking a turn for the worse. However, Don Bluth began to have his career take off in the 80s, with movies and even video games. Bluth had some borderline elements, but was mainly trying to harken back to Disney's golden years. Speaking of Golden Age, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was released. While it was not the first to combine hand-drawn and live action, it did so in such an epic and mind-blowing way, reminding people of or introducing them to the Golden Age of what animation represented for many people. Ralph Bakshi also made a contribution near the end of the 80s, where he helped revive Mighty Mouse in a brand new way. Mighty Mouse: The New Adventures. The animation seemed like it was taking its steps away from borderline and get more wacky in their movements and developments, seemingly blending with the eras that came before borderline. Many think this was the end of the dark ages that the previous 2 decades of animation were defined, as many cartoons made after Mighty Mouse began to try in how they handled the conception of cartoons. The only cartoon that could be argued tried before Mighty Mouse was Adventures of the Gummy Bears, but even that did not reach the same heights that Mighty Mouse did. DuckTales also came out the same year as Mighty Mouse, and it turned out to take more risks than Gummy Bears. But regardless, the wave of risk-taking cartoons caused a resurgence in interest and care in TV animation, making shows much less homogenized in how they presented themselves in art style and writing. This era I will call the Silver Age of animation. It was around that time when shows started to come back to a creative-driven environment rather than a market-related environment. We had styles attempting to replicate the Golden Age art like Ren and Stimpy. We had styles that were reminiscent of European artwork like with Rugrats or Real Monsters. We had a throwback to Looney Tunes in a fresh take known as Tiny Toons and Animaniacs with the help of the Japanese company TMS. We even, as I have mentioned before, saw the return of the UPA style, creating popular shows like Johnny Bravo, Samurai Jack, Powerpuff Girls, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and many more. This was the time when comic characters were portrayed in the style they were like exactly from the comics, such as Garfield and Friends and Dilbert. The animation from Disney started to shoot up to critical heights that they had not gotten in a while, both on the big screen and on the small screen. This was when adult animation on television began to crop up, with Simpsons and Beavis and Butthead being the most prominent in the 90s. There have even been borderline shows that pushed the envelope of what can be done, such as Batman the Animated Series and X-Men. Now the style or styles of the Silver Age is still not quite on the same level as the Golden Age, but it did not need to be. The new cartoons helped to breathe life into the art form that was starting to die out due to over-commercialization and very little variety presented with each cartoon. There were risks within the storylines presented in these cartoons, and even in some of the jokes. New dynamics were presented, boundaries were broken, and happy endings did not always occur. In the 2000s, there was even some experimentation with taking the anime borderline style and using it for shows in America. This was done in cartoons like Teen Titans, the second Thundercats adaptation, Ben 10, and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Some of these styles were done so well that some people actually believed that they were animated in Japan. It seemed like things were looking up in the Silver Age, even if things were not perfect. However, there was one method that popped up in the age that changed the medium forever. And that method is CGI. You of course should all know about it, but if you do not, CGI animation is taking 3D computer graphics, sometimes off of 2D frame-by-frame illustrations, and modeling and rigging them in order to create an animated sequence. Some would say it is the computerized version of stop motion. They are considered more controllable and feasible than any other technology. The illusion of movement in computer animation is achieved by having an image and replacing it with a new image that is similar to it but advanced slightly in time. The 2D models are built in a computer monitor and rigged in a virtual skeleton. There have been some films that use 3D backgrounds like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or even 3D characters cleverly created to seem a bit 2D, like the Iron Giant. They are then able to be animated in mostly any way one would please. Now this is a technology that has existed for a while now. In the 1980s there was an incomplete movie called The Works, and had it been completed it would have been the first fully made CGI film. However, many production problems led it to never getting off the ground, and maybe it was for the best, because if you look up footage from the movie and compare it to Toy Story, that was a much better start for the medium. Speaking of which, Toy Story was considered a big risk at the time, just as much as when Snow White was all those decades ago. No one would know how people would feel about the medium, thinking that it would be uncanny. Its release, however, ended up receiving critical praise and interest in the art form, leading Toy Story's company Pixar to create more films and also have television take a crack at the technique, starting with Reboot. The CGI technique even has its own form of rotoscoping called motion capture. It still exists in live-action films as special effects, but there have been fully animated movies using this technology, which many did find uncanny, and after Mars Needs Moms flopped, that marked the end of motion capture as a use in fully animated CGI films. The technique has since taken over as a method of animation in many areas, especially American movies, and the truth is, even if that wouldn't be the case, I would still feel not so great about CGI.
What? What are you talking about?
I mean, it's not bad, it's just that it is very obviously made from the computer and it feels less special and real, which is ironic because some people would argue that 3D CGI is more real, but the textures whenever you see an unfinished animation in 2D are much more visually stimulating than what you see in an unfinished animation in 3D. Even animation of 2D that is not so good often looks better than bad 3D, because there is still some effort shining through with 2D design and animation, while bad 3D will look uninteresting or like a hack job, even if there was a lot of work put into the 3D animation. Not to mention, when it comes to 3D, there is not a lot of variety. The only variety I can really see is that Pixar, Disney, and DreamWorks are more of standard CGI, while Sony and Illumination have a more cartoony aesthetic to their 3D CGI, and really that's all the difference I can find. Some people have said Disney and Pixar's character designs look more rounded, while DreamWorks' look more angular, but those are tiny differences honestly. There have even been times when it is proven that modelers are not animators. There was a time when a scene from Kung Fu Panda where when the modelers translated it to 2D, it looked mushy and forced, and when a professional 2D animator redid the sequences, it looked so much better. The reason for this is that 2D animation always keeps silhouette in mind, making sure the movement is beautiful and elegant. And let me be clear, I don't think all CGI is bad, and I know there is a lot of work, time, and money put into the technique, just like any other form of animation. Now CGI is not all 3D, because with the modern softwares you can create 2D animation as well. This 2D animation created on a computer can be split into two categories: digital puppet/cutout animation and the traditional hand-drawn frame-by-frame style. With the modern technology and the latest software, you can create traditional animation pretty much the same way as it was done in the Golden Age. South Park uses computer programs to simulate cutout animation, but the programs mostly used by animators are Flash and Toon Boom. These also use a rig to control Puppet in order to make its products. Flash started off on the internet, gaining prominence after first being used by John Crispolucci of all people, and other smaller up-and-coming creators, and companies followed suit with projects like Homestar Runner and Happy Tree Friends. Eventually, major companies and animators began using the technique, like Craig McCracken for Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends and Wonder Over Yonder, his wife Lauren Faust for My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, and Chris Savino and other artists for The Loud House. Flash and Toon Boom animation can be done poorly pretty easily, often looking ugly or at the very least jarring or robotic to look at. However, many of these animators know how to take the style and make it pleasing to the eyes for the viewer's entertainment. But even after all that talk, I'm not done yet. There is one more art style that came up in the late 2000s and just about took over in the 2010s, at least on TV, and that style is the colored style. Now, I know, not everything labeled as colored style is created by someone who actually graduated or even studied at coloreds. However, there's quite a bit of commonality within these shows, and if you remember, we have called a lot of shows the UPA style, even if most of these shows were not even created by UPA. And I also know John Kricfalusi initially used the term to criticize Disney and Warner Brothers movies, and that some people have used it for other forms of animation, but that is not what most other people go by when using that term, at least not recently. If you want to use another term, I guess Bean Smile is the one I've heard a bit, but I'm sticking to coloreds. Now that we are clear on that, let's actually discuss the topic. These shows, at least in my opinion, seem to gain traction after Chowder and the Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack. Not entirely similar, but there's a bit of commonality with their looks and even some of the writing. Plus, many people who worked on these shows went on to work on and even create the shows that more commonly employ what many people believe to be the colored style. You got the shows like Adventure Time and Regular Show, which had different looks but were closer to the common elements found within colored style. Then we get to the shows like Gravity Falls, Star vs. the Forces of Evil, Steven Universe, OKKO, that last Thundercats adaptation, and the recent Pony Life. The majority of these shows seem to have an emphasis on trying to be goofy and slightly over the top, but some also have a slight edge and an attempt at having an overarching stories, which is a bit of contrast to the design choice. There is an emphasis on lore, world building, and character development throughout the series, elements of which have all been experimented with in the past, and the idea in it of itself isn't a bad thing, but can be and has been done wrong, like when they take too long on filler episodes or introduce story elements that contradict other plot points. The other aspect of these shows is very obvious anime influences, like Dragon Ball or Sailor Moon. Often these shows will use these influences as a way to, I guess, try and have a more action-oriented vibe, though some of them don't quite work well with that setting, due to instances of being too stretchy and off-model, killing the vibe. The colored style, in this case, will tend to have character designs that are very simple and thin-lined, and also tend to have, you guessed it, bean smiles. They also have soft, squishy and stretchy looking designs that some may say is like rubber hose, but they'd be lying, as the movements still look stiffer than rubber hose. Sometimes these designs end up going off model, which wouldn't be too bad if this did not happen in more serious moments. But that does end up being the case, making things difficult to watch sometimes. Now, not all shows look like this. The Amazing World of Gumball's main family looks like what is perceived as the coloreds look, but most of the other characters look different, ranging from stop motion to CGI and even live action. One writing aspect that seems to be common with most of these coloreds shows is that they have a self-aware or meta type of humor. Not usually breaking the fourth wall per se, but saying how something will work out this way, but it doesn't work.
Don't worry. I've seen enough movies to know this is the part where the audience thinks it was all part of the show and loves it. Cue applause!
KO, we don't have to volcano our PAL cards. We can like them for what they mean to us.
I'm so glad this is all solved now. Wait! We still don't know why PAL cards exclude kappas based on super old myths.
Or how they'll mention something that's kind of a jab at the writing process when you think about it.
I'll be Gideon with my grappling hook!
Mabel, no offense, but that grappling hook has literally never helped us once.
Some of these shows do go more for comedy rather than world building, though sometimes even that does not work, making the shows feel childish rather than childlike. Now, these shows do have their strengths and weaknesses, but it is getting a bit too similar in not just looks but also the writing. I do like more variety than what we have right now, and I hope we get more of the plethora of styles like in the Silver Age, or at least more fluidity in movement like in the Golden Age. And that just about wraps it up. I hope I did not get too rambly. Maybe you found this video informative and you learned something new. Maybe you're screaming louder than the Queen of Hearts, but either way, what I really hope is that it causes discussion. Like what art styles and animation methods you like the most? What strengths, weaknesses, and other aspects did I miss? Is there a possibility of a new animation style emerging? I would really like to know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more Antoons, animated or otherwise, and until next time.